Good morning, good evening, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Sarah Mirza, and I'm currently leading the Youth Policy Forum's Environment and Climate Change Network. And I'm really excited to host today's session. I'll be the moderator for today's session, but just a little bit of background on what Environment and Climate Change Network is doing currently. We're focusing mainly in research and capacity building, like our own internal capacity building, but also capacity building of other youth. We do support a lot of evidence-based research. So we consolidate key documents such as nationally determined contribution and other IPCC reports into condensable manner, and we have a dialogue with policymakers where we try to share the summary that how we see it and how we try to explain them so that is our thought are incorporated into policy making. But one of the good things that we do is we get the opportunity to have our own team. So we have a number of research associates who are from all over Bangladesh. So we connect with them, we try to get them involved in research, but recently this year, we're trying to focus more on capacity building. So today, with much further ado, I'm welcoming Douwe. Douwe is currently working with International Institute for Environment and Development and also International Center for Climate Change and Development on local level loss and damage in Bangladesh. So his recent work predominantly revolves on how to accurately assess and address non-economic loss and damages.
I can take over from here, that's okay.
Yeah, you can just go straight to the presentation.
Okay, yes. Yeah, Sarah has some connection issues, so I'll just take over from here. Let me share my presentation. Yeah, you can see it now, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll finish my own introduction. So, like Sarah said, I will do a presentation about loss and damage and values-based research. I'll talk more about what this exactly means later. So my name is Douwe Van Schie. I am an independent researcher. I've worked with the IIED, which is an organization from the UK, and ICCCAD, which is a Bangladeshi organization based in Dhaka. And I've looked at non-economic losses and damages from climate change. And we'll go deeper into this later. Yeah, so I'm born and raised here in the Netherlands, and I have visited Bangladesh twice now for research. So I was in Bangladesh in 2022. I was in the Shatkhira district, Shamla-Karapazila, where we did a research. I was there for about 2 months. And then last November until January, I also was in Bangladesh. And we went to Durgapur-Pazela, which is in the Netrakona district, so more in the north central region of Bangladesh. So today, the presentation is threefold. So I'll first explain what loss and damage is. I'm quite aware that this might be a term that not everyone is familiar with. Then I will show a case study of our research to kind of also show more what our research can look like and every step that we took. But I'll also talk about why we integrated local values in our research. And that's also how I'm ending today. So I'm going a little bit deeper about the values part as well. So we can start with loss and damage. And I'll ask some questions in between. So feel free to type something in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and say something. So yeah, loss and damage. So with climate change, we have mitigation and we have adaptation. And I think you will be familiar with most. The image I have here is of the solar farm that has just been opened in Bangladesh, which is the country's biggest solar farm. I don't know if it's the world's biggest, but it's huge. And the goal of mitigation is to reduce the CO2 emissions or the general greenhouse gases that we're emitting into the atmosphere to prevent future climate impacts. Then we have the second one, which is adaptation. So if we don't have enough mitigation, we will have climate change, which is what's now happening. What we then have to do is prepare and adjust for the impacts that are coming. So what you see here in Bangladesh is that people build embankments, they have early warning systems, they have shelters to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So now you also have the third part, which is loss and damage, and that's what we're talking about today. And I wondered, are people familiar with the term loss and damage, and can people explain what it exactly means? So feel free to type something in the chat or raise your hand if there's any input. If not, then I'll just go on with my presentation. So I'll wait for a little bit more for people to give input if they'd like. Yeah, I'll just start with giving the answer myself already. This is good though, because it means that that I'm probably going to learn, that you're probably going to learn a little bit today. So loss and damage is addressing the impacts of climate change that have already occurred. So, oh yeah, we have it here. Irrecoverable decay, loss of natural resources. Yeah, Amiris, I think that's how you say it. Exactly. So these are the impacts that have already been, that are already happening. So if you have a cyclone, let's say you had Cyclone Amphan in 2020, that leaves some kind of damage or loss of objects. And this also has to be addressed. So this is after adaptation, because at some point we failed to adapt and things actually got destroyed. So in the chat, I think it said it was irrecoverable. That's not necessarily true. So losses are irrecoverable and damages are actually recoverable. So a loss is when something is truly lost. A damage is only when it's damaged. So, and damage, you can repair it. So that is loss and damage. And so there are two types of losses and damages. And this really is a policy thing. So you have economic losses and damages, and this should be non-economic losses and damages. And I see that I misspelled something here, but this should be non-economic. So an economic loss and damage is a loss and damage is something that is valuable on a monetary scale. So that's a house, agricultural yields, school building, roads. If this goes lost, we know what the worth of a road is. We know what the worth of a house is. So we can also give financial compensation, which is easy if you want to address this impact from climate change. On the other hand, and this is the non-economic part, these are impacts that are not valuable on a monetary scale. So if you lose nature, for example, you can't value nature in financial terms. You can't say a tree is this many taka. If there are cultural practices that are lost, you can't value this either. You can't say maybe Hindu people cannot do their puja anymore. You can't say this is this many taka. So we cannot value it on a monetary scale. And the same with mental health, depression, anxiety, stress. You can't put a number on it, which makes it really complicated to assess, but also really complicated to address these impacts. From a policy level. So this is a distinction we make. Another distinction is actually that loss and damage is, from one side, it describes the experiences that people have in Bangladesh. On the other side, it's also a very political concept. So you've probably, if you know the term, you probably know the term after COP27 or COP26, where people actually talked about it quite a lot. So yeah. Then I will quickly show the COP process. So the COP is the Conference of Parties. Just to recap for those who don't know, it's an international climate meeting where all the countries go to, and it's every year. So every year there they talk about the climate goals, about the plans, they evaluate plans, they make new plans. And the concept of loss and damage, since 2007, it kind of appeared at the COP process. And then we had an establishment of a mechanism, which is basically a delegation or a program that is there to see how we can address it. It was included in the Paris Agreement last year at COP21 in Edinburgh, or in Glasgow, which is also Scotland. The government of Scotland pledged £1 million to address loss and damage. And now last year, at COP27, many other countries joined, and there are actually talks, or they established a loss and damage funding facility, which means that now there is a facility set up, an international facility, that will hopefully in the future gain funds to actually disperse these funds to vulnerable countries, such as Bangladesh, to address loss and damage. So yeah, this is the fund. Bangladesh is one of the main proponents of the fund, which is great to see. So they are one of the main advocates that are fighting for the establishment of this fund and of loss and damage in general, especially Salam al-Haq, which is the director of ICCCAD, which is the institute that I work with. And it could be a major step in making polluters pay. And that means making the developing countries like the Netherlands or Germany or the USA pay for the losses and damages that vulnerable countries such as Bangladesh are incurring. So loss and damage in Bangladesh, of course, it's also a concept here. I mean, people experience a lot of losses and damages, but it's also a political concept here. So especially non-profit organizations and research organizations have been pushing for the government of Bangladesh to integrate the concept within their policies. And then especially the Ministry of Disaster Management and the Ministry of Forestry and Climate Change. But they have not really adopted the concept yet. So if you see that the last few biggest climate policies, they will not have the terminology loss and damage. They will talk about loss and damage, but not in the actual terminology of loss and damage. And that might be because people are quite afraid, both on an international level, but also on a national level in Bangladesh, that loss and damage funding will take away funds from adaptation funding. So they risk, okay, now we have lots of adaptation funds, with which we can adapt to climate change. People fear if now we're going to focus on loss and damage, that will kind of take this funding away. But recently, the government of Bangladesh has adopted the term. They were the president of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is an international organization of vulnerable countries. And there they adopted the term loss and damage, which also means that probably the MODMR or the MOFCC will integrate loss and damage as well. And I haven't written this down yet, but why is this important? So it's important that the government of Bangladesh integrates the concept of loss and damage, because from the international level, there will probably be funding streams coming to the national level. And then it's very good that if people on the national level are actually attuned to this international policies. So it can kind of click together. So the funding can stream from the international level to the national level in Bangladesh, and then to the local level, to the people that are actually affected. So that's a little bit about loss and damage in Bangladesh. Loss and damage in youth. So there, I included this slide because I know that you're a youth organization, and also because there is a lot of youth activism regarding loss and damage. So you have the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. I put a little link here. If you're interested, please check them out. I have also been a part of them. And this is an international organization of youth that are advocating for loss and damage on a global level. But also in Bangladesh, you now have quite some youth groups advocating for loss and damage, such as YouthNet. I picked this photo from the Dhaka Tribune, I think. So this is a little introduction about loss and damage. This is both to make you aware of the topic and to make aware that if you talk about climate policy, this is an increasingly important topic. As each COP it gets more attention, but also because it's the basis of my research. And now I will tell a little bit about the case study that we did. So it's a case study for values. It's a values-based approach to loss and damage. So I did this with ICCCAD and the IIED, and our aim was how can we actually help people in responding to the impacts of loss and damage, of climate change. And the impacts of loss and damage here means basically, the impacts of climate change here basically means losses and damages. So how can we help people in responding to losses and damages? So I will just talk a little bit about the research process, so you see a little bit what loss and damage research exactly means, how this is structured, so you know how evidence-based research looks like. So our aim was to gain a better understanding of local perceptions of climate change and the relevant contexts. So we went to Douwe, which is in the central north, and we went there and we sat down with a lot of people in focus group discussions, and we made, for example, these timelines. So we asked them, since 1998, which hazards did you experience? So here you see a flood, you see another flood, another flood, another flood, and here you see a drought. Here you see that the rainfall is changing more and more. So we made these timelines with them. I digitalized a few timelines here. So you see that recently people experience way more droughts than before. There's a really big flood here. There's a heat wave here, which they didn't notice before. Crop diseases are rising. So that is kind of what this tells us, just to see the local context together with the people. These are the more like the slow onset hazards. So hazards that that go slowly instead of a flood arrives rapidly. And a change in rainfall can, for example, go slowly. It can change slowly. So here you see that the change in rainfall is changing, the temperature is increasing, the people perceive the summers to be hotter. So we kind of knew, okay, this is what the people are facing with. This is what they're dealing with at the moment. We also made a seasonal calendar to see how the seasons are changing, but I'll go over this quite quickly. We made a hazard and vulnerability map to see how their local environment is changing and which are the most vulnerable areas. So we drew this together with them, their houses, the river. And here you see the rate of riverbank erosion, which is going very fast, 20 feet they lost of land in 2020. And here you see, for example, that they lost the bazaar here. They lost their Upazila office. The Hindu people lost the temple and a banyan tree. So this is what we do in the research. So then we kind of knew the local context, and that's when we looked at values. So losses and damages can basically be anything, especially non-economic losses and damages. They're basically infinite because you can have stress, you can have impacts on your culture, you can have impacts on education, which will have to do with your future. So climate change can basically affect anything. So to kind of keep it manageable, we sought to produce a framework together with the people so that we could look at the places that they value most in life. So we took up the concept of lived values, and that are valuations that individuals make in isolation or as part of a group about what is important in their lives and the places they live. So this concept was core to our research on how to assess losses and damages. We did 28 interviews. We asked them, for example, what their typical day looks like from the morning to the evening. And what they value most, for example, about the place that they live. We asked them, why do you value living here in your village instead of Dhaka? And they would say, we like the fresh air, we like the nature, the trees, the fact that we can be here with our family, with your grandmother, with your child. And then we had 75 values. We as researchers, which is me and then a group of Bangladeshi researchers, we grouped these in 11 values, in 11 groups. So to make it a bit more manageable, to create a framework. And then we had 6 group discussions with the people to see if they agreed with the groupings that we made, to see if they actually reflected what they deem as important. And those are then 10 values. So I pasted some quotes from the research. So a Hindu woman said that cows are mothers to us, that they get milk from the cow. And at some point that she said that she was more affectionate to it than her own child. So here we see that she values cows, but she also values the religious significance of cows. She also values the milk she gets from cows. This is a quote by a father who describes how important education is for his child. So he told us that a big part of his day was actually spending educating his child, seeing how important education is in Bangladesh. And here is a man describing his connection to nature and the services that he gets from nature, such as shadow, for example. So these are some quotes that kind of display what people value. And eventually we resulted in these 10 values. So you have development, education, health, nature, religion. We even had mental health. We know that mental health is not really a very prominent concept in rural Bangladesh. But a participant brought it up, and then we put it in the preliminary groupings, and then everyone agreed with us that mental health is something that's really important, and that it belongs to their core values. So these are our 10 values that we use to assess losses and damages with. So that's the third step. And that's actually where we looked at the losses and damages that people incurred. So the results were huge, because basically within these 10 values, people then have 20 more impacts that they have. So we had hundreds of results. But yeah, I'll just display some of them. So for example, someone said how agriculture solely depends on rain. But now that rainfall has changed, he doesn't know how to grow agriculture in the future. So yeah, the erratic rainfall and the droughts, they threaten his livelihood, because he derives his livelihood from agriculture. That's what he describes here. But you can then also imagine that this will have impact on his family, because a man has to provide for his family. It also can mean that maybe he has to move in Dhaka, to Dhaka to compensate for the income that they're now losing. So maybe he has to migrate for a little bit, and then he has to spend time away from his children. So yeah, the Hindu community said how they have a puja, which requires different flowers, but now they struggle to get these flowers because the trees don't give flowers anymore because of the lack of rainfall, but also due to the temperature increases. So flowers, they don't bloom anymore, or maybe the flowers already shed before blooming. And also, this is the same with fruits, for example. And this is someone who described the flood of 2022 that affected the 3 divisions in Bangladesh. I think it was Sunamganj, Sylhet, and Netrakorna. Yeah, and here you see how she struggled with food, which threatens food security, also with drinking, so water insecurity. They had hygiene problems, they had health problems, but also, yeah, some severe mental health impacts. As you see, the tears roll down their eyes for 24 hours and days and nights. Yeah, so these are some of the, these quotes are some of the impacts that people described. And then we asked them in 32 interviews and so like more than 100 surveys to kind of rank these impacts. So we asked them, okay, if on a 5-point scale, yeah, so how severe do you feel this is? So people, and also how important do you think these values are? So you see, people think family is very important, but a relatively less impact on family. But nature is also quite important. This is the importance scale. And this is the impact scale. And nature is impacted a lot. Development is impacted a lot, which basically portrays people's economic situation. People feel that mental health is impacted quite a lot in their health. So here we kind of saw, okay, these are the different things people value to what level. But we also saw, how these are impacted. And here you also see the differences per men and women. So the green dots are men, the orange dots are women. So you see here that women, they value mental health more, and they also feel that mental health is more impacted. The same with nature, and the same, for example, with family. Men really feel like family is not impacted. Oh no, it's religion. Women feel that religion is quite impacted, but men feel like religion is not very impacted. So this is one of the graphs that is a result from our research. But our research doesn't stop here. We have a final step, and that is seeing how people can address the issues they experience. So how can we address them actually? How can governments or NGOs help with the losses and damages they face? So we had a big list that we derived from people, that we derived from interviews with people. I think there are 24 measures here, and we asked them to rate their usefulness on a 5-point scale as well. So, for example, early warning systems, stable electricity, job opportunity. And you see here that I made a division between adaptation, and loss and damage. Oh yeah, sorry. I see now that there's a comment, and I will address the comments at the end. I think this is easier. So these are actually the ways how to address loss and damage, but these are also adaptations. So if we ask people, okay, you are incurring these impacts, so what do you want us to do? And they would say, we want a concrete embankment. And why do they want a concrete embankment? Because they said, you can give us compensation. So maybe we lose a house and you can give us money. But if the next year, again, with a subsequent flood, we lose our house again, then that house that we got is completely worthless because we lost everything. And similarly, they say you can give us cash, for example. So let's say we lose something and we get a certain amount of money, but they say that's short term. So then we only have a little bit of money for a little bit and that will run out. But if you give us job opportunities, then we can create sustainable livelihood for ourselves. And if we can get job trainings, for example, and also if you improve the roads. Simultaneously, adaptations can also be loss and damage measures at the same time. So for example, an embankment will prevent a future flood, but an embankment will also reduce people's mental stress that they maybe had after a flood. So you can imagine after a few floods, you feel very stressed about floods, which is basically a loss and damage that you incurred after this hazard. But now when you have an embankment, this stress level will fall. So yeah, these are basically the measures that people rated, also on a 5-point scale. And then we did a little debriefing session. So here you see Afsara sitting here and Ranon, another colleague, and they are talking to the people about the debriefing. We just talked with them about how they experienced the research, if they agreed with our research findings, to just connect with the community again. So that's what our research looked like. And I realize I've been speaking for quite a bit, but I will close a few minutes still with talking about values and why we actually chose to integrate the concept of values in our research and why it's so important. So values shape how people perceive risk. So let's say, for example, that you value culture, or you value your mosque, or you value your temple. That's really important to know when you want to adapt to something, because if you're going to build embankments, for example, or you're going to compensate something, it's important to know what actually needs protection. It also shows that climate change is more than just economic impacts. Often in the news, you will see a report about a cyclone or a flood or a heat wave, and they will talk about agricultural yields, they'll talk about houses, but they forget the mental health and the cultural aspects that are lost due to climate change. And again, as I said before, these impacts are basically infinite, because climate change touches upon everything that people value, everything that they do in their lives. And this concept of values kind of guided us to show these non-economic impacts of climate change. It also shows how people have different perceptions on risk, and these can vary. So I made some examples in the next slides. So, for example, due to the distinct gender roles in Bangladesh, men can maybe value more about having the providing role and providing a stable income and providing for their families, while women might value their safety and protection and caring for their children more. Of course, these are generalizations, but these are some of the research findings we had. Hindu people can maybe value fruits, flowers, and the puja more because that's what's close to their religion. Cows as well, I didn't put it here, but cows as well. While Muslim people can maybe value the mosque, the madrasa, or the 5 times of prayer more than Hindu people. People living in Dhaka might give more value to income and work, while people in rural areas might give more value to fresh air and nature. And then also what you have to realize is that the value systems of people in Bangladesh will totally differ from the value system of people in the Pacific Islands. So let's say on a global level, we want to address losses and damages. That means that addressing loss and damage in Bangladesh might look different than addressing loss and damage in the Pacific Islands, such as Fiji, for example. How did it help us in our research? So how it helped in our research is that we could build a connection between the participant and the researcher, because we had these conversations about their daily lives and what they valued, which kind of gave us a baseline understanding of what their lives look like, which is really important when you talk about loss and damages, because it touches everything in their life. And it gave us a deeper understanding of why they value something and why something needs protection, for example. How can it help with addressing loss and damage in Bangladesh? So I will quickly connect this to the first part. So at some point, we will have a loss and damage finance facility on the global level, hopefully, which means that there are more resources flowing from the global level to the national level in Bangladesh, which means that the government will have more capacity to address loss and damage. So it's important that these resources go to what people value most in life. So for example, we could build them an embankment, but maybe they just want long-term stability and they want job opportunities, for example. So it's really important that we talk to the people about their needs and about their values, so we can actually address the right things and the money goes to the right things. It can also help to show the intangible aspects of life, so the non-economic losses and damages. For example, the mental health aspect. We can give people money, for example, but if we don't give them therapy to process the trauma that they have incurred during cyclones, when they lost their loved ones, for example, then we will never fully recover what they have lost. So yeah, that's why the concept of value was so important to us, but also why it's so important in policy in general. And that was the presentation for today. I hope you enjoyed it. We will have space for a Q&A session now. I already saw that there's some comments in the chat. I'll stop sharing the presentation, or maybe I'll keep it so I can go back later. Yeah, should I just go through the chat already, or how do you want to structure Q&A?
Yeah, thank you so much, Douwe. I think that was a wonderful presentation. And I love the saying that you said that, you know, climate change is so much, it has so much multifaceted impacts on everyone's life. And, you know, sometimes we see it that you can value other people's lives to economic terms, but most of the times the non-economic values or the non-economic aspects, they're not, I would say, valued as much. So thank you so much for sharing your research findings. And I think it's so important to integrate the local values in the research, right? Because you said that in order to address something or how people are most impacted by, for example, like a riverbank erosion or even drought simply, or even floods, you can only do that by asking them what's important in their life. So I think this is a very nice methodology that even local researchers or even youth can take forward these ideas and really comprehend themselves, internalize it, and also share this with our policymakers, which will be really helpful. So now we will have some time for question and answer for 20 minutes. So we already have some questions in the chat box, and you can address them first, and then we can just have an open round, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go to the chat right now. So I already have 3 questions. So the first one is, how did you measure impact? Qualitative surveys based on least to most scale. So yeah, I'll reshare my presentation. That's the easiest. So yes, so I'll go through. First, to answer this question, I will go all the way back to the economic and non-economic. So valuing loss and damage is quite difficult. So economic things you can value on a monetary scale. Non-economic ones, I know I forgot this should say non-economic. Non-economic impacts are really hard to value. So there are lots of international debates about how should we value non-economic loss and damage. There are methods, for example, where people value biodiversity based on, for example, the ecosystem services that nature actually gives us to humans. But in general, there has been lots of controversy about this because it feels that we commodify culture, nature, health, why we shouldn't do this. That's why we in this research decided not to put an exact value on every loss and damage. What we did here is, let me go all the way here. So here we asked them to rate the impact on a 5-point scale. So this is 0, a 1, this is 3, this is 5. And we asked them, okay, how much does this actually impact your life? Just to see which are the priority areas. So what's most important to address. So here we see that people feel that nature is most impacted, and then development, and then mental health, showing that we have to look at these 3 areas when addressing loss and damage. So yeah, to answer your question, we just use surveys and a 5-point scale and kind of stayed away from the monetary evaluations. Let me see.
We have one more question.
Yeah, I'll see. Yeah, I have to chat again. So how do people... Yeah, sorry, you can go.
Sure, I can just say the question. That will be easier for you. You don't need to look at the chat. Thank you, Douwe. So how do the people perceive mental health issues in the study area? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so first of all, I always work through a translator because I don't know Bangla. So everything I know is through my translator, but I'll tell you what I know from people's experience. First of all, they won't talk about mental health. They'll talk about more like symptoms. So they'll talk about stress. They can talk about sleeplessness. They can talk about depression, for example. Quite a bit of people talked about how they feel depressed, or maybe they will use words as sadness. So they talk more about the actual symptoms they experience following a hazard. So let's say they talk about a cyclone, they'll talk about the stressful period after. Maybe they talk about how they lose their agricultural yields and the stress that's connected to not having this financial security, for example. We also heard people talking about their blood pressure being really high because of stress. So they would connect it to a physical symptom. And we heard about people that had strokes resulting from the stress. So yeah, people really talked about symptoms instead of real, like, they wouldn't say, I have PTSD. They wouldn't say, some would say I have depression, but yeah, not so often. Yeah, now Sarah, I can read the next question I have here in front of me. So, yeah, thank you for the question. But how many of any of these developing or undeveloped countries can really afford? Yes, so that is a really good question. And then I will go to this. So we're talking about this, like how far can they afford this? First of all, the government of Bangladesh has done quite a lot. I recently read a report where they said that they already have more than 25,000 kilometers of embankments now in Bangladesh, which is enormous. So the government of Bangladesh has done a lot. Of course, the government has other priority areas, such as, in general, poverty alleviation. So yeah, they probably don't have enough money with this. That's why it's so important to talk about, and then I go all the way back to my presentation. That's why it's so important about talking about loss and damage as a political concept at the COP, because that's how we can actually ensure that people are mobilizing, and then developing countries are mobilizing funds that they will give to Bangladesh, so the government of Bangladesh or NGOs can help addressing. Yeah, so that's my answer to your question.
Thank you, Douwe. That's super helpful. So we have one hand raised from Tofika, and then we can take another chat box question that also came along.
Yeah.
Tofika, do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, in the first part of the session, you have decided laws into two parts, right? One is that health is not included as it doesn't cause any economic loss. But in my opinion, I hope health does do economic loss, because as we see that if for climate change, people's health are damaging and it's not serious like economic problem. So I didn't understand why health is not included as which cause economic problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. So if I repeat right, you mean that health should also be an economic loss, for example?
Yes, I think that's what she means. Yeah.
Yeah. So I completely agree. So this is kind of like a dichotomy that has been created in the literature. So people will put health as a non-economic loss. Again, this should be non-economic. But I agree that this boundary that has been created within policy is not as clear as it is, because health is also an economic issue, because people cannot work, or people maybe have to pay for healthcare or for medicine. And then as well, agriculture and nature, for example, is really closely connected, because rice cultivation, at some point, you could say this is nature. You could also say that mental health is connected to people's income, because if people's financial security is really low, this will cause mental health aspects. So I presented it here as a very strict differentiation, but the lines are very blurry, and also meaning that something can both be economic and non-economic, but also impacts will be interconnected between each other, so they can kind of cascade into each other. And that's also what I'm going to show in my new research reports. That this dichotomy is just false, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Douwe. I think that's really helpful. So we have one more last question in the chat box. And the question is, most of the impacts of climate disaster faced by Bangladesh are the results of climate injustice. What about climate injustice that Bangladesh is facing from your perspective?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think loss and damage is basically talking about climate injustice. And if we're talking about climate injustice is a hard term, it's a broad term. But let's say, for example, that we say climate injustice is the fact that the most poor people are receiving the biggest impacts. So that is true on an international level. So for example, my country, the Netherlands, has emitted a lot of CO2, and now a poorer country, which is Bangladesh, is incurring most of the impacts. But then again, also in Bangladesh, you also see this climate injustice, where, for example, women will face a greater range of losses and damages, maybe health related, related to gynecological issues, maybe because they have more household responsibilities, or maybe because they already face more harassment, and that can be amplified due to climate change, maybe because they have to live on the embankment after a flood, and here the women are not very safe, for example. Also, maybe a poor household is worse affected because they cannot afford a deep water pump, where rich households can afford deep water pumps, so they can always keep irrigating their crops, and poor households can't. So yeah, I think loss and damage and climate justice is very closely interconnected and also very complex. But yeah, definitely the interconnection is definitely there.
Thank you for the answer. I think that makes real sense. So we have another question that came up in the chat box. And since you all also have experience in working in the southwestern part of Bangladesh, in Shamnagar, in Gabura, one of the questions that one of our research associates asks is that, the coastal areas is already impacted by saline intrusion, right? And since that's one of the most vulnerable climate hotspot in Bangladesh, so what can be a possible solution for that, since it's impacting people's lives and livelihood? So if you could answer that as well, thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I struggled with this as well. So the case study I presented is in the north. So there we didn't look at the salinity intrusion problem, but I have done a previous research where we actually did extensively look at salinity intrusion. And I think there's quite some things to consider. And that is, first of all, that salinity intrusion, like most hazards, is not completely climate change. So we have the Faka barrage in India, which is a big dam. You probably know about it, but it's the big dam in India that diverts water from the Ganges and changes the hydrology of the river system in Bangladesh. So there's less water in Bangladesh, which means that the sea can come up higher, and there's more saline water than on the coastal areas. So first of all, we have the dam. Then second of all, we also have shrimp farms. And for you who have been in rural Bangladesh in the south know that there's a lot of shrimp farms coming up. And in some way, this can be seen as an adaptation to climate change, because you could say, okay, the water is getting more saline, so we can't cultivate rice. So we are going to cultivate shrimp in saltwater ponds. So doing this also worsens the salinity levels, because you will have less rice cultivation, which is freshwater. You will have more shrimp cultivation, which is saltwater, which raises the overall salinity levels of the area even more. So I think two very tangible things that we can do is that the government will support farmers to actually be able to do rice cultivation there. For example, in saline-resistant rice varieties, but also just giving them compensation. So maybe if their yields don't work, give farmers compensation so they can actually still proceed with the freshwater rice farming to lower salinity levels. So yeah, I think a lot of the things I just recalled are are more related to development than actually to climate change, because you can't just reverse this whole salinity intrusion, but at least we can reduce the anthropogenic, so the human impacts on it. And this is a huge role, for example, the government of Bangladesh, but also NGOs who have been promoting shrimp farms, who shouldn't have done this maybe in retrospect, and also banks such as the World Bank who have invested in shrimp farms, and in retrospect maybe have incurred a great scale of harm to people in coastal Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Douwe. I think that's really helpful, especially, the consequences of shrimp farming, because I think since there was lack of prior consultation with the local communities and what they want, but as well as, a study should have been generated before implementing it at a wide scale. So thank you. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to add on to this as well. With the shrimp farm, now you will have a lot of big companies who are doing the shrimp farms. You have huge shrimp farms who are buying away the local people. So in some kind of way, money and the economy is being prioritized over people's well-beings, and I think that's really important to address. But yeah, sorry, Sarah, you can ask the next question.
No, I think that's really helpful. Thank you so much. So I don't know if you had the chance to review the National Disaster Management Policy of Bangladesh, Douwe?
Yeah, I have read everything lately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So we have a question from another research associate from Youth Policy Forum, and she asks that Bangladesh has gained a lot of praise for its national disaster management policy. So what other countries thought about this policy and its success?
Yeah, so I can't specifically say what other people think about the national disaster management policy, but I can talk about policies in general. So yes, Bangladesh is internationally praised about disaster management and how they have reduced losses and damages, especially, for example, losses of life from cyclones and floods, for example. And similarly, a lot of countries are also maybe inspired by Bangladesh, introducing more disaster policies, and especially close to loss and damage. So I can't really give a good answer, but it is true that Bangladesh has received international praise for their policies. And I think that other countries are catching on, and Bangladesh is often portrayed as a poster child for other countries to kind of, as like an inspiration, but more than that, I don't know, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And you're quite right that even though we have a number of instrumental policies, I would say, and we developed our national adaptation plan, like I would say in 2005, and then we have a developed plan in 2022. But we were focusing on adaptation since a long time, but I think there is still a lot of opportunity to improve in terms of monitoring the policy, especially the implementation, and also the collaboration between the local government bodies and the national government bodies. And when it comes to ministries, collaborating, that's also key, because in our cases, since the policies are developed, within different ministries, so I feel like this is very important for them as well to have a dialogue, to review the plans, to see where it's going. Is it really being implemented? So thank you. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. And I can quickly add on to this. So it's really important to realize that if a policy is made, it doesn't mean that it's implemented. Like you just said, there's a huge disconnect in every country from the national to the local level. So yeah, Bangladesh is definitely praised for a lot of things, also to include gender, for example, in a lot of policies. But then on the ground, it can happen that this implementation is not really followed. So yeah. I saw
and then
there was...
we just have another comment, and that is regarding that salinity resistant crops, that farmers use. Most of them do not always rely on paddy, but there was an intervention plan to introduce other salinity resistant trees, but it was stopped by Ministry of Forest. Their justification was, we cannot introduce foreign breed into an ecosystem without knowing how it will affect in the long term. Do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, so I'm no forestry expert, but I do think this is a really good point, is that you can't just have a solution and put it on the ground and it will work. So like you said, you can say we want to introduce salinity resistant trees, but then that will affect the local ecosystem because maybe they will become an invasive species and affect other species, for example. And this is the same with embankments. For example, let's say you want to adapt and you want to build an embankment, then you maybe also increase the chance of waterlogging after a flood because the water flow will be confined, for example. So all the measures that I just put out with a list to address things, it's never as simple as it looks like. So yeah, very, very good comment, definitely.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I totally agree, because I think in most of the, when you go and talk to the vulnerable communities living in these remote areas, sometimes they would say that, this forest department just came and they asked us to plant these trees, but maybe sometimes they didn't work in favor for them, right? Because as you mentioned, that the soil might be different. It would not be best suited for the atmosphere to grow that tree. And sometimes even the birds, the animals who reside in the forest, they might be affected as well. So thank you. I think these are great points. We have one last question. So when there is a talk about funding loss and damage, how do you think we should negotiate with the international community?
Yeah, so I know a little bit about international negotiations, but not that much. I haven't been at a COP myself, also because I feel it's a very slow, big process, and that also does not always yield the right results. But so how should we negotiate? So I think the government of Bangladesh always sends out a delegation and has been really vocal together with other vulnerable countries. For example, the V20, this is a group of 20 vulnerable countries where they negotiate during the COP process. So what I want to say is these negotiations are ongoing and Bangladesh has quite a strong position. And I think the negotiations on loss and damage within the international community, they now mostly rely on the COP process. But next to this, you also have lots of legal issues going on. So for example, Vanuatu, the small island nation, has recently taken the issue of climate change to the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the Netherlands, to see the actual legal consequences of climate change. Because of course, you can see it as a crime that rich countries are emitting so much emissions, affecting countries such as Bangladesh. So I think how should you negotiate is the COP process, litigation, and then next to this, you also have a advocacy part where the youth can play a role. So yeah, like I showed on the slide before, let me see. Yeah, you have protests here at the COP, you have protests here in Dhaka, you have youth describing what loss and damage means. We also have researchers like mine that show how loss and damages look like and how heavy the impacts are of climate change. So those are all activities that are done by people and that you could potentially join.
Thank you so much. I think those responses are all very valuable, and it's so helpful to learn from you. So I think it's almost end of time. So I would just like to thank you for joining us and giving us a very interesting and enticing presentation about how to integrate local values in our research going forward. I think we will always appreciate this session, and as this is live streamed online, so any of our research associates can go back and watch it again to learn it and internalize it. And in any cases, if they want to learn more, then we can have some other sessions in future as well, after you're a little free from your busy schedule. But thank you so much. This has been a pleasure to moderate this session and learn from you as well, Douwe. And I really liked the question and answer session. I think it was very interactive, and everyone in the chat box and also by raising hand, they asked questions. And I think we plan this capacity building session to be a thing throughout this year. So you know, in future, we will plan to have some more sessions, and maybe we would love to have you in some other sessions as well, where you give us another perspective on loss and damage. So thank you, and very good night, good morning to you. Have a great day, and do add something at the last if you want to.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you everyone for the questions. And I do want to encourage people to look at loss and damage as an issue and look at the advocacy side, because that's so instrumental and so important. I'll put in a little link here in the chat for those who can, I hope this is the right website, which is the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is a group of youth who, wait, I can make the link better. It's ldyouth.org. Yeah, look at those websites and what they're doing, which is a group of young people, mostly from the global south, who advocate for loss and damage. And I think it's so important. But yeah, mostly thank you for all the questions and for listening. And who knows that we'll see each other in the future again. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Ciao.
Bye bye. Dhonnobad. Ciao.
Ciao.